Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Sabine Zielke, and as the director of the North American Studies program and the German-Canadian Center of the University of Bonn, I welcome you to the fifth event of our lecture series, The White House Embattled, the US Election 2020. And I welcome in particular, of course, our speaker, my colleague, Dr. Simone Knebels. Good evening, Simone. We're very much looking forward to your contribution tonight.
I'm happy to be here. Thanks for including me in the series.
Great, welcome. As most of you know, our events are a co-production in cooperation with the Bundeszentrale für politische Bildung and the America House in Cologne. And I thank especially Christoph Müller-Hofstede and Anna Hoff from the Bundeszentrale and Dr. Benjamin Becker and Katharina Kiefel for their support in this endeavor. Just as in previous election years, our focus over the summer is on issues relevant to the current presidential race. And yet, these are special circumstances, as we all know, for both the US election and our lectures. We've been zooming our way through the series of lectures, even though we much rather interact with our speakers and with you, our audience, face to face. And yet, doing this at a safe distance also allows us to open up the conversation, which is really a good thing. Just a few words on procedures. We will have a short Q&A session at the end, but for now, we have muted our audience to allow for better transmission. And we're also recording this lecture and make it accessible afterwards. Now, our lectures engage the upcoming election from multiple directions and follow a presidential race that unfolds under previously unknown conditions. Conditions that have been shifting considerably. At the beginning of our series, the COVID-19 pandemic seemed to have curtailed the presidential race and most particularly the visibility of the Democrats. Donald Trump took center stage and made each one of his appearances part and parcel of his re-election campaign, and of course he still does. Our goal was and is still to bring back to our attention what keeps moving off our screen. Meanwhile, though, there are other distractions. The stage is completely reset, and in the light of the murder of George Floyd and the ongoing demonstrations against police violence and racism in the US, the White House is newly embattled. The commander-in-chief seems to be building a big, beautiful wall around the White House. And there's hope that at least some of those who are out on the street right now might find their way to the voting booth in November and possibly help ending this unprecedented presidency. But then we should not get our hopes up too high, for who knows what's ahead in the remaining 5 months. Until early July, we'll be engaging, among other matters, transatlantic relations, Trump and trade, foreign policy once again, and gender matters, as well as the far field of populism, which is our target tonight. A full program and more details on individual lectures and how to take part in the events is available on our and our cooperation partners' websites. And now I'd like to briefly introduce to you our speaker, PD, Dr. Simone Knebels. PD stands for Privatdozentin. It's an odd term because Dr. Knebels is not teaching privately. She's at a public university. Simone Knebels is Senior Lecturer, Akademische Rätin, Oberrätin in the North American Studies program, and her expertise is in literature and culture of North America. Her research interests range from modernism and modernity, poetry and poetics, literary and cultural theory, the early American novel, and late 19th century fiction, to popular culture, television and new media consumption, and the intersections of literature, culture, and the economy. And it is our great luck that Simone Knebels has been with us for quite some time now. She received her MA in North American Studies in 2005 with a thesis on pragmatism and utopia in the work of Charlotte Perkins Gilman. A work, a thesis that in 2006, and this is really rare, became her first book with the main title, Making Progress. Her PhD thesis was completed in 2010, also in Bonn, and published as her second monograph entitled Modernist Authenticities, the Material Body and the Poetry of Amy Lowell and William Carlos Williams. And her postdoctoral project, or Habilitation, finalized in 2018, will appear next year with Lexington Books under the title The Politics of Private Property, Contested Claims to Ownership in U.S. Cultural Discourse. In addition, Simone Knewitz has co-edited volumes on the cultural effects of 9/11 and on discourses of knowledge in U.S. culture, as well as essays on nostalgia, love and literature, TV series and media economies, and much more. For her research, Dr. Knewitz spent time at Harvard, George Mason, and George Washington University, among other places. She received various scholarships and grants and has lectured far and wide. Currently, her research and writing is focused on political rhetoric and aesthetics, media and digital culture, economic criticism, and critical white studies. What characterizes Dr. Knewitz's work is that it is highly original, always a step ahead in concepts and methods of what our field seems preoccupied with. And her writing is wonderfully clear-headed, concise, and a pleasure to read. And yes, this is an advertisement. Finally, Simone Knewitz has been an inspiring and extremely engaged colleague over many years, to whom our program and I owe much deeply felt gratitude. Her talk tonight carries the title, I'm the President and You're Fake News, Populism and the 2020 US Election. And it will show that populism is not an idiosyncrasy of right-wing rhetoric, as is often suggested, but a style of discourse found across a broad political spectrum. Simone, the screen is all yours.
Thank you very much, Sabine, for this much too kind introduction. I'm not quite sure that my talk can really live up to that. I will quickly share my screen. All right, so you should hopefully now see the presentation. And if for some reason you can't hear me at any point, please interrupt me. Because I will not know if you don't hear me, but for the moment I hope everything's fine. Yeah, so the topic of my talk is populism today, and I have a written script that I will read out slowly, and I hope it's easy to follow that way. When I came up with the topic of this talk in February, the trajectory of the 2020 election campaign looked radically different from what it looks like today. BernieSanders was surging in the polls and winning primaries and caucuses, and for a brief moment, he seemed on the path to becoming the nominee of the Democratic Party. A grassroots movement from the political left was making headway to a direct confrontation with Trumpism, promising to put populism at the square center of this year's presidential election. Accordingly, the quote I originally chose for the title of my presentation, "A Campaign of, by, and for Working People," came from the Twitter account, not of Donald Trump, but of Sanders. In February, Sanders, in a rebuke to the party establishment, had emphasized that his campaign was financed by the little people. Our campaign does not do high-dollar fundraisers in wine caves or on Wall Street, he noted with an implicit thrust at his competitor Pete Buttigieg, and continued, "We're the only leading campaign to not have a single billionaire donor. We're funded entirely by grassroots donors. This is a campaign of, by, and for working people. 4 months later, this quote looks like an anachronism. Not only has Sanders long dropped out of the race, but the people are no longer working either, as unemployment numbers have shot up to record highs due to the repercussions of the COVID-19 pandemic. Currently, it looks as if the only brand of populism left in the race is the Trumpian version, and most likely it will be here to stay for at least the next 5 months. As his administration is scrambling to deal with the pandemic and protests against police violence are raging, Trump is mostly focused on doing what he knows to do best: engaging in a polarizing campaign, putting himself into the media spotlight and spreading disinformation, while denouncing experts and journalists of the liberal press. As he did in the now infamous press briefing on April 23, when he mused about the benefits of swallowing disinfectants for battling a coronavirus infection. When Washington Post journalist Philip Rucker, during that press conference, responded to Trump that people were looking for guidance and information in these briefings, not rumors, Trump put him into place by saying, "I'm the president and you're fake news." In Trump's playbook, his office gives him total authority to define what counts as the truth. Anyone disputing or criticizing him is automatically discredited. In the last weeks, Trump has expanded this approach even to his favorite media outlet, Twitter. In my talk today, I want to assess the current populist moment in American politics as we approach the 2020 election. Though Trumpism is currently the most significant form of populism we are facing, I want to take the opportunity of this talk to situate the phenomenon in a larger historical and theoretical framework. The United States as a nation has always had a special relationship to populism, and a largely positive one at that, conceiving of it as a form of radical democracy. But with Trump, as well as with the recent global rise of populist movements, an authoritarian form of populism has come to the fore, raising the question of how populism relates to democracy. Though omnipresent in our media discourse, the definition of the concept of populism is a rather contested issue for scholars working on the phenomenon. There are at least 4 different ways of thinking about populism. In my talk, I will try to elucidate 3 of them with reference to the 2020 election campaigns of the Democratic primary candidates and Donald Trump. Populism as a form of style or rhetoric, as a political strategy, and as a political logic. The 4th definition, which frames populism in ideological terms, has been fairly prominent, but I will nevertheless only mention it here without discussing it in detail. It is a useful approach if you're primarily interested in programmatic contents and policies, but I find the other 3 approaches more valuable for talking about the significance of populism in the current context. My talk will be structured into 4 parts and a short conclusion. In the first section, I will briefly introduce the historical American populist tradition and the concept of populism as a form of rhetoric or a flexible mode of persuasion. The second section will argue that during the Democratic primaries, this rhetorical approach was best exemplified by ElizabethWarren. The third section turns to BernieSanders, suggesting that he relies on populism as a political strategy, an approach also most recently endorsed by political philosopher and activist Chantal Mouffe. The fourth section reads Donald Trump's presidency as characterized by a populist political logic that is qualitatively different from Warren's and Sanders' form of populism. Part 1, Populism as a flexible mode of persuasion, an American tradition. In the American political imagination, the term populism has often been valorized positively as the ideal of a radical democracy, in which the people themselves are installed as the rightful sovereign. In this sense, the American Revolution, which overthrew the rule of the British aristocracy on American soil and established a government of the people, has been interpreted as an original populist moment. The nation's founding creed entails the idea of popular rule and a rejection of elitism. Building on this notion, scholar George McKenna in the 1970s suggested that populism is a specifically American ideology. Though populism is clearly not merely an American phenomenon, the US could be called with some justification populism's country of birth. The very term populism in English was actually first used as a descriptor for the US People's Party in the late 19th century, whose members referred to themselves as populists. At the turn of the 20th century, the US was in the midst of the corporate revolution, a profound economic transformation that entailed dire life and work conditions for large fractions of the population and a concentration of wealth among a small capitalist class. The People's Party was a fusion of diverse groups with conflicting interests, among them Southern and Western farmers, as well as labor activists from the industrialized Northeast. They were united by hostility against the economic and political establishment, which controlled the railroads, the banks, the factory system, and national politics in Washington, D.C. Feeling that the plain people were not represented within the two-party system of Republicans and Democrats, the People's Party emerged as a third-party force to reclaim power for the people. The populism of the People's Party can be foremost characterized as a specific rhetoric. Populist rhetoric tends to establish an antagonistic relationship between the people and the elite. At the same time, the populist account is also deeply moralistic. The people are always valorized positively, whereas the elite is denigrated for its alleged abuses of power as self-serving and undemocratic. The People's Party came together in its first national convention in Omaha in 1892, where it ratified its party platform on the highly symbolic date of the 4th of July, Independence Day. Their program painted a dire picture of the perceived current state of the nation in crisis. Quote, "We meet in the midst of a nation brought to the verge of moral, political, and material ruin. Corruption dominates the ballot box, the legislatures, the Congress, and touches even the ermine of the bench." End of quote. Employing hyperbolic language, the populists claimed that the capitalists, in conspiracy with the government agencies, were enriching themselves at the expense of farmers and workers. Quote, "The fruits of the toil of millions are badly stolen to build up colossal fortunes for a few, unprecedented in the history of mankind. And the possessors of these in turn despise the Republic and endanger liberty." End of quote. To address their grievances, they aim to restore to the hands of the plain people, to restore government to the hands of the plain people, with which class it originated. 4 years later, in 1896, the ideas and ideals of the People's Party were represented by William Jennings Bryan, who became the presidential candidate of both the Populists and the Democratic Party in the election against the Republican William McKinley, the representative of the Eastern establishment. In his now famous Cross of Gold speech at the Democratic National Convention in Chicago on July 9, 1896, Bryan argued that the party had to represent the interests of the producers, the farmers and workers, the hardy pioneers who built up the country. Calling upon history, he pictured himself as the heir of both Thomas Jefferson and Andrew Jackson, two former presidents associated with the democratic populist spirit. For Bryan, the populists' claim to power rested in the argument that they were the authentic representatives of the plain people and would reinstate truthful democracy, the will of the people, just like the American Revolution allegedly had. The historian Michael Kazin has characterized populism as a flexible mode of persuasion, which depends on specific tropes, images, and themes that various groups and political actors have employed to voice discontent and mobilize people for their causes. Kazin suggests that the original populist movement of the 19th century instantiated a vocabulary of grassroots rebellion, which, after World War II, was increasingly appropriated and altered by conservative groups and politicians, including presidential candidates and presidents like George Wallace, Richard Nixon, and Ronald Reagan. Defining populism in terms of a rhetoric or style, rather than in terms of specific ideological contents, certainly seems convincing in the American context, in which the appeal to the people is a mainstay of political rhetoric, especially in election campaigns. A potential disadvantage of this definition, however, is that populism in this sense is gradual, based on the style of individual politicians. It then becomes very hard to make truly qualitative distinctions between the populism invoked by, for instance, a Barack Obama from the populism of a Donald Trump. If we want to say something specific about the phenomenon of populism that challenges or threatens the established institutions of liberal democracy, we may need a stricter definition. Part 2. The true heir of the People's Party. ElizabethWarren's fight to rebuild the middle class. Let me now turn to the context of the 2020 elections. I first want to discuss the primary campaigns within the Democratic Party, which started out with a crowded field of more than 20 candidates last year, before quickly zooming in on Joe Biden this March. The candidacies of ElizabethWarren and BernieSanders in particular brought a progressive form of populism into public discussion. When we hear populism, we think Donald Trump, but we should be thinking ElizabethWarren, historian Greg Cantrell argued in a Washington Post article in July 2019. Following the idea that populism is really more a style of political rhetoric than an ideology, Cantrell suggested that liberals like ElizabethWarren were the true heirs of the late 19th century populist movement. For Cantrell, the legacy of this populism is a liberal, inclusive program that unites people across racial lines, appealing to them in terms of shared economic grievance, with highly progressive proposals. Other newspaper commentators similarly diagnosed a populist turn in Democratic politics. Even a more moderate candidate, Kamala Harris, in her announcement speech explicitly attempted to claim the mantle of a new populism, choosing the slogan, "For the people," for her campaign. For some commentators and political actors on the left, populism is the cure, not the disease, as Thomas Frank argued in The Guardian, calling the Trumpian version a phony populism. ElizabethWarren's populism may certainly be considered in terms of a style or rhetoric that picks up on the ethos of producerism invoked by 19th century populists. In her vocabulary, the plain people equal the middle class, who built up America after the Great Depression, but whose members are now increasingly deprived of the fruits of their labor. Calling up her childhood in the 1950s and 60s as an era of economic security for the middle class, she established a stark contrast to the contemporary situation, in which the same class of people finds itself without social safety nets. Warren campaigned on the promise to restore the middle class, which had come under attack due to the deregulation of financial markets, the destruction of unions, and the undue influence of corporations, banks, and lobbyists onto the political process. In a campaign video, she accuses the wealthy and powerful of setting traps for the middle class, which then led to the financial crisis of 2008. Quote, "Billionaires and big corporations decided they wanted more of the pie, and they enlisted politicians to cut them a fatter slice. They crippled unions so no one could stop them, dismantled the financial rules meant to keep us safe after the Great Depression, and could cut their own taxes so they paid less than their secretaries and janitors." End of quote. Warren depicts the assault on the middle class as a conspiracy of billionaires and big corporations who, like puppeteers, direct the actions of politicians. Against this conspiracy, she positions herself as an academic muckraker who committed herself to studying the structural problems of American society, only to uncover that economic inequality was the result of a larger plan. Her calling as a politician appears like the result of her findings, the decision to confront the broken system heads-on in the wake of the financial crisis of 2008. Clearly, Warren positions herself as an outsider, an academic who left the classroom in order to pursue a higher public goal. On the campaign stage, she consistently presented herself as a member of the middle class who used to work as a special needs teacher, regardless of the fact that this part of her career lasted only for 1 year before she went on to law school and became a law professor. She thus downplayed her academic achievements and elite position. Warren's definition of the middle class is extremely inclusive, reaching to cover the lower 99% of Americans in terms of wealth and income. Warren actually proposed a wealth tax for any assets over $50 million, meaning that only the most wealthy Americans would have had to pay it. As Benjamin Wallace Wells wrote in The New Yorker, Warren's campaign rests on the theory that the past decade has transformed the way class is felt in America, so that instead of the uneducated against the educated, or the heartland against the coasts, it is now also possible to run a widely inclusive populist campaign against the ultra-rich. Interestingly, however, Warren gained a following particularly among the educated upper middle class. The New York Times endorsed her candidacy, but ultimately she did not manage to forge a broad coalition that would have won her the nomination. Part 3, Not Me, Us. Bernie Sanders' shot at political revolution. Bernie Sanders advocates many of the same positions as Elizabeth Warren, who in fact adopted some of his plans, for instance, the idea of Medicare for all. Yet Sanders employs a different kind of populist rhetoric from Warren. In his 2020 campaign, he consistently de-emphasized his own person and instead stylized himself as the spearhead of a political movement, as suggested by his campaign slogan, "Not me, us." Unlike Warren, who presented herself as a crusader on behalf of the underdog and promised to resolve the most pressing issues single-handedly, "I've got a plan for this" was a slogan she frequently invoked. Sanders proposed to install a progressive political movement in the White House. In a rather unusual fashion for a presidential candidate, Sanders did not speak of an I, but a we, rhetorically making his campaign that of a collective. Thus his campaign website promised, "When we are in the White House, the movement we build together can achieve economic, racial, social, and environmental justice for all." As becomes clear in his 2017 book, Guide to Political Revolution, the movement that Sanders aspires to empower is what he calls the younger generation. Directly addressing the most progressive generation in the history of the country, Sanders proposes it as his objective to stir young people into political activity. Quote, "We must move boldly forward to revitalize American democracy and bring millions of young people and working people into an unstoppable political movement that fights for a government that represents all of us, not just the billionaire class." End of quote. Throughout the text, Sanders uses the first person plural pronoun we instead of I. The latter appears much more sparingly. Yet, as becomes evident in the previous quotes, the community included in the we is not always the same. Sometimes the we refers to the members of the political movement. In other places, it refers to all of us, thus signifying the American people as a whole. Sanders, in fact, in the text makes a distinction between his addressees, the younger generation, and the whole citizenship. Setting up the discussion of his political demands in the following chapters, the foreword establishes as a premise the alleged will of the American people. Sanders thus proclaims that the vast majority of Americans support a progressive agenda and widely reject the economic views of the Republican Party. His claims frequently rest on assertions on what the American people understand, know, or want. His movement is thus meant to represent pars pro toto the American people overall. What Sanders is selling to his prospective voters are not merely progressive policy positions, but a different style of politics, a movement of direct democratic participation instead of democracy as a spectator sport. In Sanders' case, I would argue that rhetoric plays an important part, but that his populism is better grasped as a strategy of mobilization. Populism in that sense, Robert Jansen explains, is a specific set of actions that politicians and their supporters do in order to mobilize marginalized social sectors into publicly visible and contentious political action. Sanders serves as an inspirational figure for young, racially and ethnically diverse progressive Americans to run for political office on local, state, and federal levels, and therefore to wield political power. This engagement is driven by opposition to the threat of Trumpian authoritarian populism and, more crucially, to the belief that the established institutions of liberal democracies have been co-opted by neoliberal capitalism. Sanders' approach is reminiscent of a theory of populism recently proposed by political theorist Chantal Mouffe in her 2018 book, For a Left Populism. Mouffe argues that the political left must adopt a populist strategy as a response to the current crisis of neoliberalism and the rise of right-wing populist movements. The current populist moment, she believes, creates an opportunity for the left to remake democracy, as the dominant hegemony is being destabilized by the multiplication of unsatisfied demands. A left populism would be an emancipatory project that aims at radicalizing democracy, at establishing more extensive structures of political participation than they exist in currently established systems of liberal democracy, which, she claims, have deteriorated into a state of post-democracy. By that, she means that Western democracies have become mostly technocratic states dominated by the tenets of economic liberalism, which presents itself as a regime with no viable alternatives and which is endorsed by all established parties. At the same time, both wealth and political influence are increasingly concentrated among a small elite, eroding the democratic principles of broad participation and equality. Right-wing populism, Wolff suggests, emerged as a symptom of this democratic deficit. The task for a left populism is to reorient populism away from exclusionary authoritarianism and toward more inclusive, egalitarian objectives. Wolff sees populism as a way of doing politics that relies on an antagonistic strategy. This strategy strives to create a unity between diverse political demands by establishing a common adversary, the establishment. As Wolff explains, quote, "A left populist strategy aims at federating the democratic demands into a collective will to construct a we, a people, confronting a common adversary, the oligarchy. This requires the establishment of a chain of equivalence among the demands of the workers, the immigrants, and the precarious middle class, as well as other democratic demands, such as those of the LGBT community. The objective of such a chain is the creation of a new hegemony that will permit the radicalization of democracy." End of quote. Wolff emphasizes that she envisions her populism as a strategic and anti-essentialist one. Unlike a right-wing version of populism that essentializes a part of the population as the authentic people while excluding other parts, Wolff proposes a strategic alliance of various social groups in order to change the discursive framework of politics. The existence of a common adversary is necessary to construct a we. Yet, contrary to authoritarian forms of populism, the adversary is not essentialized as an enemy. Wolff claims that confrontation and antagonism are central to political discourse. Her ultimate goal is not to establish a populist regime, but instead a progressive hegemony. That is, she wants to recalibrate the dominant values of politics. Sanders clearly pursues a similar strategy of changing the discursive framework in which politics in the US takes place. And even though his candidacy is no longer viable, his movement will potentially still be impactful in the coming years. Part 4, Total Authority. The populist political logic of Donald Trump's presidency. Turning to the populism of Donald Trump, let me begin by pointing out the ways in which Trump is not a populist. If we have so far discussed populism in terms of a particular rhetoric and as a strategy that aims at a democratization of representative institutions, these are not necessarily the most significant elements of Trump-style populism. In terms of populist rhetoric, the perhaps still most consistently populist speech Trump ever delivered was his January 2017 inaugural address, crafted by his advisors at the time, Steve Bannon and Stephen Miller. In that speech, Trump built on the core populist opposition of the people versus the elite, as he dramatized the moment of his taking office as an empowerment of the people. Quote, "Today we are not merely transferring power from one administration to another, but we are transferring power from Washington, D.C. and giving it back to you, the American people." End of quote. Yet this speech is not the most typical of Trump's rhetoric, which is more often characterized by superlatives which he ascribes to his own person and achievements. And while Trump's election may have been a symptom of the current failures of representative democracy, it is hard to perceive him as a leader of a movement that gives power back to the people. To analyze the populism of Donald Trump, a stricter theory of populism, advanced by Jan Werner Müller, provides a helpful framework. In his 2016 book, What is Populism?, Müller suggests that it is a necessary but not sufficient condition to be critical of elites in order to count as a populist. Taking issue with the definition of populism as a form of radical democracy, Müller instead argues that populism is a political logic that relies on a profoundly illiberal and, in the end, directly undemocratic understanding of representative democracy. He points out that, in fact, populists are not against representative democracy. They merely believe that they, and they alone, are the truthful representatives of the people. The populist logic depends on a moralistic imagination of politics, which is by definition anti-pluralist, because it denies the legitimacy of any political opposition. According to Müller, BernieSanders and ElizabethWarren do not count as populists. Using the same label for them as for Trump is a false equation. The fact is, Müller wrote in the New York Times this January, that Mr. Sanders and, to an extent, ElizabethWarren are simply daring to diverge from sappy talk about healing America as a nation. They are saying loudly that we are not all equally in this together, but instead that we have sharply opposed interests. Their rhetoric is perfectly compatible with democracy. By contrast, Trump's approach to politics is characterized by authoritarian thinking. Müller's complete dismissal of the populist label for Warren and Sanders may be a bit too quick, because he simply excludes a whole range of historical instantiations that have been described as populist in the service of sharpening his definition. Nevertheless, I find his approach very useful to understand the logic according to which populists in power, like Donald Trump, but also Viktor Orban in Hungary, Erdogan in Turkey, or Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil, operate. In what sense, then, can we conceive of Trump as a populist? The core claim of populism, Mullah writes, is that only some of the people are really the people. In May 2016, Trump announced at a campaign rally, "The only important thing is the unification of the people, because the other people don't mean anything." For the justification of his power, Trump relies on a circular logic. He sees himself as the representative of the American people. But in his conception, only his base constitutes the authentic people. Everybody else has a lesser claim to citizenship. They don't count. As the representative of his base, he is therefore the president of all real Americans. According to this logic, it makes sense that Trump's instinct is always to play to his base, since all other political claims lack legitimacy. In line with this thinking, a couple of weeks ago, he retweeted a video in which one of his supporters claims that the only good Democrat is a dead Democrat. At the same time, it is important to note that invoking the people here does not necessarily mean that the president responds to the needs or wishes of actual people. Though Trump needs to make sure to keep the support of his followers, he is not concerned with making policies for the people. Instead, he relies on a divisive form of identity politics. His politics require merely the symbolic representation of the people. The function of the people is to symbolically confirm him as their true representative. This is why after the 2016 election, Trump insisted that he lost the popular vote to Hillary Clinton, not because he simply received fewer votes, but because of widespread voter fraud. Because he sees himself as the authentic leader of real Americans, any majority for an oppositional candidate must somehow be illegitimate. What counts is the morally correct outcome of an election, not the empirical result. If the empirical outcome is not correct, then the system is rigged. Thus, in an early April press conference, Trump declared that his opponents should not be allowed to win the 2020 election because of the great job his administration has done. Before the coronavirus put an end to political rallies, these gatherings with crowds of his supporters were the central symbolic element for Trump to stage his support by the people. During the shutdown, he replaced these events with the infamous daily press briefings that were broadcast live on television. As a former reality TV star, Trump has always understood his presidency as filtered through the prism of entertainment. As Megan Garber has pointed out in The Atlantic, Trump brings the logic of TV as a medium to his presidency and has built a presidency of stage production. In late March, Trump compared the viewership of his briefings to the ratings of reality TV shows on Twitter. Quote, "Because the ratings of my news conferences, etc. are so high, Bachelor finale, Monday Night Football type numbers, according to the New York Times, the mainstream media is going crazy. Trump is reaching too many people. We must stop him," said one lunatic. "See you at 5 p.m. In lieu of surrounding himself with supporters at his rallies, Trump thus relied on his alleged ratings to prove his popular support. Much has been made of Trump's use of social media. His administration has even been dubbed the Twitter presidency. Yet his major achievement in this respect is perhaps that he has managed to make his social media use a story in itself, even though he has not experimented with these media in any particularly innovative way. There is a conventional assumption that social media provide populists with the means of unmediated or direct communication with their base. Though this is of course not the case, Twitter is no less mediated than more conventional media. Trump's tweets merely rely on authenticity effects, as he seemingly puts his immediate thoughts into a maximum of 280 characters. Twitter simulates directness. And though Trump could theoretically engage in conversations with his supporters, or even opponents, he rarely does so. Twitter for Trump is a convenient way to retweet controversial content put out by others without taking responsibility for it. The medium is also his means of agenda setting for the mainstream media. Most ordinary citizens are not on Twitter. It is a medium used mostly by a technological elite of users and multiplicators. Twitter is valuable for Trump because it cuts out the middleman. At least until very recently, when Twitter started to put warning labels on some of Trump's tweets, there were no gatekeepers, unlike in the mainstream media, which Trump therefore despises. Trump uses social media and media attention to delegitimize communities and political opponents, to quash dissent, and to spread disinformation and conspiracy theories. As a populist in power who likes to claim that he has total authority to do as he pleases, he is not interested in a critical civil discourse on political issues and actively tries to suppress a critical opposition. As the allegedly only truthful leader, Trump rejects the idea of independent political institutions and the rule of law. Populists in power tend to colonize the state. As Christy Parker and Yasha Monk point out, Trump has corrupted the purpose of an ever-growing list of democratic institutions, making them to serve his own interests instead of the public good. Thus, he has filled bureaucratic positions in the Department of Justice, the State Department, or the FBI with loyalists, waging war against what he sees as a deep state, which does not follow his partisan political interests. In one recent, particularly egregious move, the DOJ dropped the charges against Michael Flynn, Trump's former national security advisor, who had already pled guilty to the charges of lying under oath. The administration thereby directly interfered with a criminal case against one of the president's loyalists. Parker and Munk noted in early April that perhaps the only authoritarian play Trump hasn't made yet is corrupting the upcoming election with the pandemic as an excuse. Yet they also cautioned that he will still have manifold options to do so, and we already see signs of this. While it is hardly conceivable that Trump could postpone or suspend the elections, he has already shown that he is willing to meddle with the election when he tried to pressure Ukraine into investigating Joe Biden. And he is already undermining efforts by states that seek to expand voting by mail options, even openly threatening to cut federal funding for swing states with Democratic governors. On May 20, he stated this openly in 2 tweets directed at officials in Michigan and Nevada. Quote, Michigan sends absentee ballots to 7.7 million people ahead of primaries and a general election. This was done illegally and without authorization by a rogue Secretary of State. I will ask to hold up funding to Michigan if they want to go down this voter fraud path. End of quote. Michigan Secretary of State Jocelyn Benson, in fact, did not send absentee ballots, but application forms for such ballots. And some red states have taken similar actions without being threatened by Trump. There is no evidence that absentee voting increases voter fraud. There's also none that Democratic candidates would benefit more from expanded options of voting by mail than Republicans. In many places, in fact, absentee ballots have generated significant turnout for Trump and the Republican Party in the past. Even if Trump does not follow through with his threats against states governed by Democrats, he is sowing profound distrust in the integrity of elections, paving the way for claiming that he was pushed out of office illegitimately should he lose the election in November. For the moment, Trump seems on the defensive, as protests in Washington, D.C. and many other cities are continuing after the death of George Floyd and other African Americans at the hands of police. Trump keeps calling for law and order and for the use of law enforcement and the military to dominate the streets, while hiding himself from the protesters inside a fenced-up White House, which increasingly resembles a fortress. As the Washington Post noted last Friday, quote, the White House is now so heavily fortified that it resembles the monarchical palaces or authoritarian compounds of regimes in faraway lands, strikingly incongruous with the historical role of the executive mansion, which, since its cornerstone was laid in 1792, has been known as the People's House and celebrated as an accessible symbol of American democracy. These images and how commentators perceive them puts in stark relief just how much Trump has retreated from even the merely rhetorical claim of his 2017 inaugural speech to give power to the people. Currently, he projects the impression that he is afraid of his own citizens. At the same time, his predecessor Barack Obama last week expressed his solidarity with the protesters. Obama claimed political protest as the core of the American national identity by recalling the original moment of the American Revolution, thereby also gesturing to the American populist tradition. To conclude, the claim that Trump's populism is qualitatively different from that of an Elizabeth Warren or Bernie Sanders does not seem too controversial. In fact, we could even ask whether it is appropriate to use the same label for all of them. From the perspective of a progressive left that wants to claim the American populist tradition of radical democracy, Trump at best represents a phony populism. From the perspective of political scientists approaching populism from a mostly European tradition of scholarship, Trump is an authoritarian populist, whereas Warren and Sanders are not populists at all. What we are confronted with then are two different outlooks within the current political discourse. One which sees populism as a grassroots strategy to democratize the institutions of liberal democracy, and one which considers the populist logic as a threat for liberal democracy and the rule of law. The point in my mind is not to say that either one of these positions is right or to differentiate between a good and a bad populism or real and phony versions. Instead, I think that these debates about populism point to larger questions about the nature of democracy and the issue of political representation. And we have to critically reflect on whether a left populism might not share some of the qualities of the authoritarian version that puts it into a more troubling light. Can populism really be a means to revitalize democracy? If populism, with its moralistic opposition between the people and the elite, always relies on a divisive logic to mobilize support, is a progressive form of populism a viable strategy to rebuild people's trust in democratic institutions? Can progressives forge a large coalition which is truly inclusive, or will their own moralistic approach further antagonize and divide the public? I'd be happy to discuss these and other questions during the Q&A. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Simone, for a very illuminating talk that complicates matters and that really sort of explores a term and a practice that seems to be misunderstood very often. And so I'm really looking forward to our discussion because you gave us a lot of food for thought. And I'm sure we have a lot of, there's a big audience. I'm sure there's questions and comments. And I would also like to encourage the students to ask questions if they have questions of understanding. Don't hesitate. You can raise your blue hand if you have a question, and our moderator, Ms. Helps, will call on you. And so we have more than half an hour, and we should take our time. Thanks again, Simone. It's wonderful. It was so topical. Yeah, we already have questions. I see that. Great.
Yeah, one of the students from the seminar has actually emailed me and asked to ask a question. Ms. Ortmann, would you like to ask your question yourself?
Yes, of course. I hope you can hear me.
Yes, you can.
Yeah, I think that Ms. Knewitz already answered my question in her presentation, which was very interesting, by the way. My question was, why does Donald Trump uses Twitter and social media in general that much, and what are his intentions behind his tweets with reference to populism? And I think that the last part covered this question pretty good, so
yeah, I mean, as I said, I think it's for him a very good or convenient way to go around things like fact-checking, right? Everything that would call into questions is his position, or everybody that would kind of do a quality check, right? Is kind of yeah. Is kind of, well, he can circumvent that, and he can bring those issues that he wants to bring into discussion. He can do so without anybody filtering his ideas.
Yeah, thank you.
Another question was posed by Anna Apolinarski, and she asked me to read it out. So the question would be, could one say that Trump's populism is more dangerous because not all of his claims are and have been truthful? I just feel like there's a difference in Trump and, for example, Warren's style that goes beyond left or right-wing populism, which makes it difficult to compare. I mean, this goes a little bit into the direction of the theories you explained.
I mean, yeah, I definitely think that Trump's populism is more dangerous and does more damage. And in terms of presidential candidates like Warren or Sanders using a populist rhetoric, I think we would have a hard time to envision them acting in the same way that Trump does, should they actually assume the presidency, right? So even Warren especially uses a fairly stark rhetoric at times and really it's very, very critical and very harsh about the elites, right? I think that in her case, we could fairly securely argue that she would work differently if she really had a position of power. So this is also why I think we really need to make some kind of a differentiation.
Okay, thank you very much for the answer. In the meantime, 4 further questions have come up. The first was, I guess, by Jan Pui.
So my question number 1 was a bit about the history of populism. Since I'm also studying history, I've wondered if the populism is somewhat derived from the ancient Roman populares. Like in America, we also have the senators from ancient Rome, so I was kind of wondering if you know anything about that.
So my expertise is American history. It doesn't go that far back, but of course the idea of participation, right, has a long history that goes back to Aristotle and to Greek philosophy, and so these models of democracy, of course, have a long history. I don't think that, for instance, the Populist Party in the 19th century necessarily was inspired by that far back in history. I think they were claiming more the ideas of the American Revolution. So I'm not quite sure whether that answers your question, but there's a specific very American tradition, I think, of always referencing the founding of the nation and this original moment.
Yeah, that's fine. Like I don't really know much about either. I was just wondering because the terminology is so the same basically.
If I may comment on that, because I'm also studying history and was also interested in exactly that point. As far as I know, populism in Rome was more a special kind of making politics in the sense of using the people. And the question that came up in my mind was a little bit like, okay, populism is of course always said to refer to the people, but is it really a working for the people or a working with the people as tools?
Well, it kind of is, I would argue, because Caesar, for example, didn't really have the upper class on his side, and he did a lot with the support of the people. Like, he couldn't actually have worked if all the people in Rome wouldn't have liked him.
And Dr. Knivitz, would you say this kind of is similar, or?
Well, I'm not sure how far the comparison goes, but I think this is what I meant with the idea that, especially for Trump, right? It's what the people symbolize more than doing something for the people, right? Of course, he needs electoral votes. even though the electoral college is enough, right? I mean, he can lose the popular vote, but what he does all the time, or what's really important for the claims that he makes is this is the people as a symbol, right? They're there to authenticate his rule, so to speak, right? So in that sense, I would say, yeah, he's using the people, right, in this yeah, for his symbolic politics. And here I would argue that, of course, BernieSanders also would has to appeal to the people, right, in order to get the votes. But arguably there is a different quality here, and I guess this is also where this controversy comes in about real and phony populisms, where some say, well, but there is, or there could be a kind of populism that really serves the people, where the people can get or gain some direct influence and political power, which is always a fiction in a way in a representative democracy. But there is this claim to the people really having the power, right? So actually that's yeah, that's an important, or that's part of the problem of representative democracy in general, right? And this is perhaps also why populism is always this some call it the shadow of representative democracy, right? Because our idea of democracy is that the people really are in charge or have the power, but of course in a representative system, there is never the direct rule of the people. So there's always so representative democracy never lives up to that claim of direct representation.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think this also answered another question that was posted in the chat, asking about, yeah, you said that Trump doesn't represent actual people, but it is a rather symbolic representation. And the question was what exactly you mean by that, but I think you also elaborated on that right now. But if there's like one sentence you could put it into.
Yeah, I think it's really the idea that Trump is not that interested in the people, right? He's not interested in doing something for actual people, but he is interested in having this. I mean, he really likes to bathe in the crowd and have this very visual representation also of his supporters and to show to the world that he is the president of those people.
Okay, yeah, thanks again for elaborating. I think the next question actually comes from a colleague who has raised the hand, Majshiri.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Now, first off, thanks for this really interesting conversation. It has my head buzzing with so many thoughts. One thing that came to mind, or maybe a combination of things that I want to ask you, and it's a fairly open-ended question about Joe Biden and the question of populism and race. So speaking of Biden, you know, his campaign was often as sort of going back to the Obama years, as a certain return to an older normal, so to speak. You know, he also has a certain high level of popularity amongst the Black community, or at least he certainly sort of campaigns along those lines. But his credential with the more populist left that you talked about is certainly questionable. And there's indications such as, you know, his proposed cabinet picks being, among other people, you know, Jamie Dimon of JP Morgan Chase and Michael Berg's names floated, not a lot of people representing that more populist tendency. And I'm wondering what you think about Biden's relationship with populism, particularly in light of these protests, which of course are very fluid and dynamic and evolving. And one thing I'll say that's really interesting that I've noticed lately is that there has been a lot of conversations about the participation of non-Black Americans, particularly white Americans, in unprecedented levels. And I'm wondering if that could also be considered a form of populism around this social movement and questions of racism in America. So I guess I'm asking sort of two questions: that wave of potential populism on the basis of race, and how Joe Biden might tie in with that.
Well, I think, I mean, in terms of in American election campaigns, I think all candidates to some extent have to rely on a rhetoric of populism, right? I mean, it's so ingrained in American elections and in these drawn out campaigns that that I think you would always find some kind of an appeal to the people. So to me, Biden doesn't strike me as particularly populistic in comparison to the other candidates. And at the same time, I think because even already during the primaries, like there was this shift towards populism to some extent. I think all the candidates in a way have to position themselves to that and to adapt in at least to some degree to that kind of rhetoric. So I'm not sure that answers your question. I'm not quite sure what about the second part of your question. Are you saying whether we could understand the protests and what we're seeing right now as also as in terms of a populist movement?
Yeah, I mean, it's a hard question to answer. This is very fluid, and so it's more of a speculative sort of question, very, very open-ended. If you see elements of populism in this moment, and if you have any thoughts on how that might tie in with the presidential campaign. Mm-hmm.
I mean, I would definitely see a populist element in that, not so much perhaps in terms of rhetoric, or perhaps also in terms of rhetoric, but I think what we're seeing right now would tie in fairly well also with the kind of theory that Chantal Mouffe proposes, that's based on also on her work together with Ernesto Laclau, where they would say that, well, for them, I mean, they have a very broad concept of populism, which is basically the politics as such in a way is populist for them, because for them politics is really about a populist politics is really about the unification or the establishment of equivalences between various political demands and that are not represented, and bringing them into the political discourse. So in that sense, yes, I would say there's definitely an element of populism at play here. And if this becomes a longer lasting viable movement that also ties in, which I think is already the case with the progressive movement that we're seeing right now in the US, then I think that's a kind of coalition, or that could potentially be the kind of coalition that Mouffe has in mind.
Thank you very much for answering this question. And I think the next one in line would be Jan Buchkremer.
Yeah, hello. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Okay, so this is kind of a mean question to ask, because you just said that your expertise was American history, but I wondered if populism actually differs around the world, if populism is different in the European Union, if it's different in Latin America, in China, or in countries that aren't like China, actually, countries that aren't really democratic at all, maybe even going back in history, like populism is a term since the ancient democracies of Greece. So how has it changed over time, and how does it compare around the world?
Well, that's really a big question. I mean, maybe we can break that down a little bit. I do think there are a certain similar features, or that we, or at least resemblances, right, that you can see perhaps between Donald Trump and Viktor Orban. There are also differences. I would say, or most people would say that Viktor Orban in Hungary is very systematic in extending his power. I don't think Donald Trump is as systematic, thankfully. And of course, the political systems also work differently in different countries. So a populism in Germany of the AfD, for instance, will be quite different from an American version of populism, because we have very different political systems, right? With in Europe or in Germany with a much more distinguished party system than we have in the US. So the particular political systems, also the historical context and the specific time that this all plays a role, and also of course whether the country is or counts as an established democracy, or maybe a country in which democratic institutions are not as stable or have never been as stable. So yes, I think you can find some resemblances between different countries and make comparisons, but there will necessarily always also be differences.
Thank you. I think I overdid it a little. I'm sorry.
That's fine.
Yeah, thanks for the question. The next one came in by Mrs. Buckler. Here we go.
Hello, good evening. First of all, thank you very much for this wonderful talk, which was very enlightening and inspiring. And I think I would like to return to what Machidi in his question alluded to, which is, and which you also mentioned, you began with and ended with actually, which is the protests for Black lives right now. You kind of in the end mentioned Obama's remarks that linked the current protests with a tradition of American revolutionary populism. And I was wondering if you could say a little more about how those different populisms that you described in your lecture relate to this struggle for Black lives and racial equality, especially when, for example, Trump, you haven't said that much about that yet, but also the others, how do those different populisms relate to the struggle for Black lives and racial justice?
I mean, if you look at Warren or Sanders, I think that their claim is that they want a populism that is inclusive, right? They're advocating for really a broad coalition of people, and I think in that sense it's always debatable. You always need you need an outside in populism, right? Because you always have this stark dichotomy between the people and the elite for one thing. And so for Warren and Sanders, I think the outside here is always defined economically. But of course, at the same time, there would also be and they would certainly be more endorsive, right, of these protests or of these reforms that are being advocated. At the same time, I think there's also a tendency to exclude, for instance, the Trump voters, right, or those people. I mean, they are not the elite, but I'm also not sure that the progressive movement really wants to embrace them. And then, of course, with Trump, right? I mean, he over the past few days, right, he has kept insisting on law and order, on he's very much against all these calls for defunding the police. He's really trying to protect the status quo, and of course he pays some lip service to what's happened to George Floyd and other African Americans. But I think there's no willingness to engage with a systemic problem of racism here. And I mean, we know there are plaques for Trump, right? But overall, I think they're in this. Well, this African Americans are not the core of who he sees as his voters too. I'm not sure whether that answers your question.
No. Yes, sure. Thank you.
The next question actually goes into the same direction. It was posed by Michaela Mattes and asks, do the ongoing protests on racism cause declining support among Trump's supporters?
Whether the protests will cost Trump supporters, did I get that right?
Yeah, exactly.
I think it looks that way for the moment, right? As I haven't really followed the polls very closely, but what I've read is that he loses among white voters across all income and education spectrum. So and in most places, I think Joe Biden is in the lead. So for now, I think yeah, the protests do cost him votes. The pandemic already also has cost him some support. I think there is a core of supporters who is not easily swayed, but there are a lot of people who did vote for him during the last election who I think are having second thoughts. But whether it will really cost them the election, I mean, I surely would hope so. But then again, I mean, if we just consider what's happened over the past 3 months and then think about that it's still 5 months until the election, a lot of things can still happen until then.
Yeah, that's true, of course. Another question that came in was by Irene Bez. I hope I pronounced that right. Is it possible that Trump uses anti-Semitic tropes in his discourse when he refers to the elite? I mean, it is obvious that he is part of the elite, but it seems that he wants to make this distinction of which elite causes white US American problems. I think that the phrase "the elite" has attracted white supremacists.
Well, it most definitely has. I mean, I don't have an example at the top of my head where Trump used anti-Semitic rhetoric, but I think there were a couple. Of course, I mean, he's usually not that overt, right? But of course he's playing to certain people. I mean, he's using a kind of rhetoric that will be noticed especially in right-wing circles. And of course, Twitter is also a good tool for that, right? Because he really keeps retweeting all kinds of stuff by that comes out of more of right-wing online activism and various groups. And of course, he does not take responsibility for the content of what he's retweeting, right? And you never know, right, why a person is retweeting something. Is that necessarily always an endorsement? And we don't know if it's not being made explicit. And he really likes to play with that.
Okay, I can imagine that from what one hears from him. Another hand has been raised by Ms. Hungate.
Thank you. I had a question, once again, going back to the phrasing of Trump's populism invokes people. And so my question regarding that is, with his populism, he does invoke people to support him, but would you also argue, especially with the recent events, that he's invoking people to not vote for him as well? especially regarding the Black Lives Matter protests and also his corona response. Because I mean, I have a couple of friends who live in Atlanta, Georgia. They're voting today in the primaries, and currently the lines are 2.5 hours long to vote. I had a friend bring a lawn chair to go sit and vote. But people seem to be very amped up and very energized to really kind of, for lack of a better phrase, stick it to Trump at the moment. So I was curious what your opinion was based on your populism research.
So do you mean he invokes people not to vote? Do you mean that they're not voting in
Him.
Right?
So invoking people to vote against him.
I mean, yeah, I mean, I think it's in the current situation, it's really difficult to tell. I mean, there are so many things going on with the votes and all these, and that's also something that frankly worries me about the election, in how far there can actually be regular elections. I mean, there's always the problem of people who want to vote but don't get the chance to vote, right? But with the conditions of the pandemic and the problems with absentee voting and things like that, things seem to be more irregular than they usually are. So I think it may be more a matter of who will actually get the chance to vote and who is disenfranchised by the circumstances and also by the strategies that the Republicans and the Trump administrations take to keep people from voting.
I do assume that there are many more questions. Ms. House, is that true, or am I?
Yeah, at least some more questions.
Okay, I think we have to come to an end, and I also like to squeeze in my question and observation before we come to an end. Simone,
I think there's only one question left.
there's only one? Okay.
Yeah, I just checked. This would be.
Take that question. Right.
That is very nice of you. This would be by Marie Eisheuer. I'll unmute you.
Hi. This might be a bit of too vague of a question, but hypothetically, if Trump was to win another, to become a president for another 4 years, how do you think his populism would influence the US, especially if you look at the situation right now with all the protests going on, and he seems to be kind of agreeing with discrimination against women and minorities. So what would you say about it?
I mean, I think we should really, really hope that he doesn't get another 4 years, because I think that would do really a lot more damage, and it would really embolden him even more, just like the impeachment trials kind of vindicated him and kind of made him bolder. If he really were elected again, I think that would really lead to even more, much more profound and lasting damage to the democratic institutions in the US. So one example would just be, I mean, he already nominated, or he already got 2 conservative federal Supreme Court judges in. He would most likely get more. He could nominate more Supreme Court justices. He also packs the lower courts with conservative justices. So that's a central issue. But I think on all kinds of fronts, I think he really would. I mean, the system would erode even more. What that would mean in terms of what we're seeing now in terms of protests and how that would play out with another presidency, I don't know. I mean, it's hard to say what will happen next month at this point, right? I don't know, maybe, I mean, people are really angry right now, so you could almost envision a democratic mob go over the barricades and and chase him out of the White House. So no real predictions on that end, other than that we should really hope that he doesn't get another term.
Yeah, I agree, and I also agree that we shouldn't get our hopes up too high. As you also said, we don't know what's going to happen. Just one thing, Simone, it was eye-opening to me. I always thought when Warren was still running in the primaries, that she could stand her ground next to Trump because she had a different kind of program, and she would sort of be the only one in that group that would probably beat him. But I understood now that, I mean, she could stand her ground because she was also working on this kind of populist rhetoric. I didn't see that before I heard you about this comparison. But my question is referring more to Sanders. I mean, Sanders' populism obviously didn't really affect that kind of participation that Chantal Mouffe claims populism could do. It could sort of renew democracy, because at least in the previous election, and of course Sanders voters didn't want to vote for Hillary Clinton, but they didn't go to the voting booth, and that was part of the problem. It seems right now that the whole initiative with the rallies now, the protests against racism, you see a lot of people running around with placards November 3rd. So it seems like this kind of, and I would agree, it's also a kind of populist movement at the moment, is maybe, and that's where the hope comes in again, is maybe sort of pushing people to the voting booth. But my question would go back to Sanders' way of populism. He didn't make people vote in 2016, right?
Yeah, I think, I mean, and this is why I also think that Sanders' populism really operates a bit on a different level, and not merely in terms of rhetoric, because I think his, especially now in this election campaign, I think the major goal, or what really drives him and his movement, was not so much mobilizing people to go vote, but to mobilize them to actually become candidates and become active. And I think in that respect, he was successful. And I don't really have empirical data, but people like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and many of these other, especially young women of ethnically diverse backgrounds that are now in Congress, and also I think on many local and state levels, I think he inspired a lot of people to actually get engaged and to run for office themselves. So maybe it's more of a long-term strategy, right? Or at least that's what I would also hope for. And of course, the other thing is with not going to vote, right? That there was and is a lot of activism, very progressive, that where people were not really ready to compromise very much, right? And where they didn't go out to vote, or didn't then support the more moderate candidates. And I think, I mean, what Joe Biden right now does is trying to integrate the progressives, and I guess some of them are really also taking him up on that. So hopefully this time it will be different, and they will also turn out for Joe Biden. But I wouldn't necessarily see Sanders' campaign as a failure, right? I think it's perhaps it's more of a longer term approach, and I think in shifting, and one could also say that in some respect he was successful, because this progressive movement has changed the terms of the debate, right? I mean, it would probably be more successful if it really manages to overcome that split with the more moderate Democrats, because I think there is a split in the Democratic Party that weakens the party, right? And it's a kind of split that we don't have in the Republican Party, where Trump has kind of the support of, I don't know, 90% of Republicans.
Well, thank you, Simone, for this really insightful talk and for a wonderful conversation that is so topical and so in time. I also want to thank everybody in the audience who posed interesting questions. And I also want to take a look ahead. So thank you again, Simone, and we'll keep on having this conversation, I'm sure.
Yeah, and thank you to the audience for all these questions.
Yeah, thank you. And we got all of them done, which is also good. Before we close, let's take a look ahead. Next week, our guest will be Dr. Gerlinde Kreuter from the Institute of Political Science at the University of Regensburg. Her talk is entitled Disruptor in Chief or New Normal, the Trump Presidency and the Erosion of the Transatlantic Alliance. And that's also very topical. So please come see us again next week. Be well and have a good night. And thanks again, Dr. Simone.